Are you threatening me?
I'm warning you. Remove it from my land or I shut it down today.
The heavy tire of the Tesla Model S rolled precisely over the dry gravel, coming to a halt exactly 3 inches from the border of the manicured turf. Jordan Vance did not turn off the engine immediately. He sat in the air-conditioned cabin, the quiet hum of the electric motor barely audible, and watched the rearview mirror. Through the reflective glass, he saw the white electric golf cart creeping up his driveway like a silent predator. Behind the wheel was Evelyn Sterling, the newly elected president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. She didn't knock, she didn't call out. She simply stepped off her cart, clipboard in hand, and slapped a bright red notice of violation directly onto the driver's side window. Jordan rolled down the glass, his expression entirely neutral, and looked up at her. I was 32 years old, a senior data scientist and financial risk analyst for one of the largest investment banks in the country, and he had spent his entire career identifying variables that people tried to hide. I was also a tall, athletic black man with sharp, observant eyes who had learned early in life that when people with clipboards tried to make you feel small, the only logical response was to make your documentation twice as complete as theirs. "You're violating Section 4, Subsection 2, Evelyn said, her voice carrying the practiced corporate pleasantness of a woman who had spent her career in middle management and had never once been told no. Sucking power from an exterior outlet is an aesthetic violation. We have standards for Whispering Pines, Mr. Vance, and your tire is resting on the common lawn boundary. That's a $200 fine effective immediately." She tapped her pen against the clipboard, waiting for the defensive stutter or the quick flash of anger she usually used to establish dominance over her neighbors. Jordan did not argue. He did not point out that the outlet was built into his own garage wall or that his tire was sitting squarely on his own gravel. He reached out, took the paper, and looked at the signature block. It was signed in a sharp, aggressive cursive that he had already seen on a dozen warnings stuffed into his mailbox since he moved in 3 weeks ago. "I'll look into it," Jordan said calmly. He rolled the window back up, put the car in park, and sat in the quiet cabin while the golf cart whirred back down his driveway. He did not feel angry. He felt the cold, analytical focus that came over him whenever he found a broken line of code in a multi-million-dollar transaction ledger. Evelyn Sterling believed she was managing a routine compliance dispute. She had no idea she had just entered her own name into an audit. The house at the end of the cul-de-sac was a modern steel and glass structure that Jordan had purchased outright after cashing in a substantial portion of his stock options. It was designed to be clean, efficient, and private, a perfect retreat from the 16-hour days he spent tracking systemic risk and scraping financial markets for anomalies. I had chosen Whispering Pines because the marketing materials promised a quiet, self-governing community where residents could live without the noise of the city. He had read the 47-page covenant document before closing, noting the standard clauses about lawn height and paint colors, and assumed that as long as he kept his property immaculate and paid his quarterly dues, he would be left alone. I was wrong. The neighborhood under Evelyn's leadership was run less like a community and more like a private fiefdom. Every lawn was trimmed to the identical 3 inches. Every mailbox matched the same shade of slate gray, and the residents operated under a constant low-grade background hum of anxiety, waiting for the next red slip to arrive in their mailboxes. Evelyn had built her reputation on the promise of protecting property values, and she had taught her neighbors to believe that her constant, meticulous inspections were the only thing standing between them and the complete decay of their neighborhood. Jordan's second notice arrived 4 days later. This one cited him for installing unauthorized window treatments because he had hung minimalist black roller shades in his study instead of the association-approved beige linen curtains. The fine was $300, with an additional $50 per day for non-compliance. Jordan stood in his kitchen, his coffee cup warm in his hands, and looked out the window at the white golf cart slowing down near his gate. 2 security guards in matching Navy uniforms, guards hired by the HOA from a private firm owned by Evelyn's brother-in-law, were standing by his fence taking photographs of his side yard with their phones. They were trying to create a climate of constant surveillance to make his own home feel like a place under active investigation, and Jordan recognized the administrative pressure immediately. It was the same systematic harassment corporate managers used to force out employees they didn't want to pay severance, to a slow-motion compression designed to squeeze his resolve until the cost of staying felt higher than the cost of surrendering. I walked to his study, opened a new folder on his desktop, and labeled it simply, Whispering Pines HOA Active Dispute. He scanned the window notice, uploaded the timestamped security footage from his own cameras, and began to build his database. Within 20 days, the letters arrived with the predictable regularity of a subscription. Every Friday afternoon, just as the offices closed for the weekend, another red slip would land in his mailbox. One week, it was a citation for leaving his trash can at the curb 12 minutes past the posted collection window. The next, a fine for parking his truck in the driveway at an angle the board deemed non-compliant with community aesthetics. A third notice claimed his eastern fence line had exceeded the maximum allowed height by 4 inches. Each new complaint carried its own penalty, and each penalty stacked neatly on top of the last, designed to build a debt large enough to feel threatening. Within 90 days, the claim balance had reached $12,000, and the letters had begun to carry the explicit threat of a property lien and eventual foreclosure. Jordan watched the white golf cart slow down near his gate. Most afternoons, Evelyn Sterling, sitting behind the wheel with her clipboard, her eyes scanning his house with the focused, counting look of a person who believed that everything she looked at would eventually belong to her. He did not write back in anger, nor did he hire a local property attorney to beg for an extension. Instead, he sat at his desk, opened his terminal, and initiated his first line of actual inquiry. As a financial risk analyst, Jordan's entire professional life was built around the understanding that people who perform authority aggressively almost always have something to hide. When a balance sheet doesn't make sense, you don't argue with the person who wrote it. You simply scrape the underlying transaction database until the weight of the numbers makes the lie impossible to ignore. He started by analyzing the public filings of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Under state law, any planned community association was required to maintain a secure, transparent portal of financial ledgers, audit reports, and vendor contracts for public review. But when Jordan logged onto the association's member portal, he found that the financial tab was empty, replaced by a single PDF summary of the annual budget that carried no itemized breakdown and no supporting receipts. He ran a routine security scan on the portal's directory structure and discovered that the association's administrative server had been configured with a set of default security permissions that left the underlying financial directories fully accessible to any member with a basic understanding of network architecture. It took him less than 10 minutes to download 4 years of raw transaction ledgers, bank statements, and vendor invoices directly to his local drive. He spent the next 3 nights working under the soft glow of his study lamp, running the data through a series of forensic accounting scripts he had developed for identifying corporate embezzlement. Within hours, the columns of numbers began to tell their own story. The clumsy, obvious story of a small-scale siphoning scheme that had been allowed to run unchecked simply because nobody had ever demanded the receipts. Every month, a flat fee of $3,400 was transferred from the community's infrastructure reserve fund to an entity called Sterling Solutions, LLC, a company registered in Delaware, whose principal officer was listed in corporate filings as Evelyn Sterling's brother. Over 4 years, more than $160,000 had been quietly moved into that account, approved personally by Evelyn in her capacity as president, without ever appearing in the annual budget summaries presented to the residents. The invoices attached to those transfers carried no itemized breakdown of services, no progress reports, and no verifiable work orders. They were simply monthly extractions of community cash paid directly to her family's bank account, while the neighborhood's actual infrastructure reserve dwindled to near zero. There was more. Jordan cross-referenced the maintenance invoices for the neighborhood's common areas and found that the landscaping contracts had been awarded exclusively to a firm owned by another board member's husband at a rate that sat nearly 40% above the average market cost for municipal mowing work. The special assessments levied against the residents for emergency drainage repair had been collected and deposited into the operating account, then immediately withdrawn to pay for administrative consulting services that carried no supporting documentation. Evelyn had been using the fines collected from residents to cover the deficits in the operating fund, turning her code enforcement campaign into a systematic extraction machine that funded her family's lifestyle while keeping the association's books technically balanced on paper. Jordan compiled the findings into a highly structured 50-page forensic audit report, cross-referencing every transaction with the bank records, the corporate filings, and the state property statutes. He backed up the files to 3 separate cloud drives, printed a physical copy, and placed it inside his manila folder. I had the names, the dates, the bank transfers, and the signatures. He had the entire structure of her authority, and it was written in her own handwriting. While he was compiling the financial data, Jordan initiated his second line of inquiry, establishing the physical reality of the boundary line. He called Tom Willis, a licensed professional land surveyor who had mapped property lines in the county for nearly 30 years and asked him to conduct a comprehensive independent boundary survey of his lot. Tom arrived on a bright Thursday morning with a truck loaded with high-precision GPS equipment, a total station, and a set of original county cadastral maps from the 1980s. I was a methodical, unhurried man who spent 2 full days walking the boundary, driving steel stakes with bright orange caps into the earth at measured intervals. Evelyn Sterling drove past twice on her white golf cart during those 2 days, slowing to a crawl near the fence line. Her clipboard raised as if she were taking notes on the survey crew, but she did not speak to them. She had apparently decided that the survey was a sign of desperation, an old man's attempt to find a few inches of ground to argue over, and she saw no reason to interrupt a process she believed would ultimately confirm her own authority. Tom did not look up from his equipment, did not offer her a wave, and did not pause his work until the last marker was driven. When Tom finally walked up to the porch steps on the second evening, his boots caked in wet clay, he set his field notebook on the table and looked at Jordan with an expression that mixed professional caution with quiet amusement. "You don't just have a clean deed, Jordan," Tom said, pointing to a diagram he had sketched on his tablet. "You have an encroachment, and it's a massive one." He walked Jordan through the coordinates, the association's freshly installed $250,000 solar-powered vehicle charging station, which had been featured in their quarterly newsletter as a premier community amenity, crossed onto Jordan's property line by nearly 6 feet along a 50-foot stretch of the boundary. The concrete foundation, the steel structural columns, and the high-voltage electrical conduits were all planted firmly in soil that belonged legally to Jordan Vance. The encroachment had occurred because the developer had simply laid the concrete pad along what looked like a convenient line without ever pulling the deed survey to verify where the private lot actually began, and Evelyn's board had approved the construction without requiring a new boundary verification. Tom compiled the findings into a formal sealed boundary report, stamped it with his professional seal, and filed it with the county recorder's office the following morning, making the encroachment a matter of official public record. Jordan forwarded a copy of the survey report to the association's legal counsel within 48 hours, along with a formal notice of trespass and a demand that the concrete foundation and the electrical conduits be removed from his land within 30 days at the association's expense. The response from the law firm was curt and dismissive, written by an associate who had clearly not taken the time to read the deed reference numbers. The letter insisted that the association's boundary line was established by historical usage and that any attempt to restrict resident access to the community charging station would result in immediate legal action. Jordan did not respond to the letter. He simply placed it in the folder marked Active Litigation Preparation and waited for the upcoming town hall meeting. I knew that the only way to stop a system built on intimidation was to force the people running it to defend their paperwork in a room they did not control, and Evelyn was about to hand him that room. The emergency town hall meeting was held on the first Thursday of November in the community center at the end of Sycamore Lane. The room was standing room only, every folding chair filled, and dozens of residents standing along the back wall, drawn by the rumors of the $12,000 fine and the foreclosure notice that had been circulating through the neighborhood for weeks. Evelyn Sterling sat at the long folding table at the front of the room, flanked by her 4 board members, her posture rigid and her chin lifted in her usual expression of practiced elegance. She opened the meeting with a presentation on the Heritage Preservation Initiative, speaking about home values and standards and the importance of compliance, her voice carrying the smooth corporate cadence of someone who had spent her life managing rooms of people who didn't know how to look at a balance sheet. When she finished her remarks, she clicked her laser pointer to a slide showing Jordan's house and announced that the board had voted unanimously to initiate foreclosure proceedings to satisfy the outstanding fines. "We must protect the integrity of our standards," she told the room, her voice echoing through the PA system. "No resident is above the rules we collectively agreed to maintain." Jordan stood up from the third row. He did not carry a clipboard, did not raise his voice, and did not offer any preamble about his family's history in the valley. I walked to the front of the room carrying a small laptop and a gray USB drive and connected it to the projector before the board's attorney could stand to object. The first image that appeared on the white wall behind the board was the original county deed. The legal description, highlighted in yellow, followed immediately by Tom Willis's certified survey map showing the concrete foundation and the high-voltage conduits of the community charging station sitting 6 feet inside his property line. "For 3 years," Jordan said, his voice level and unhurried, "this association has been trespassing on private land. The charging station your residents use every morning, the foundation you paid $250,000 to install, sites on my property. and your legal counsel has ignored a formal notice of trespass informing them of this fact. From this moment, I am revoking access to the station and cutting the power line running across my boundary." A low murmur ran through the room, the sudden fabric rustle of 80 people shifting in their chairs at once. Evelyn did not move her hands, remaining folded flat on her clock binder, but her eyes locked onto Jordan with an expression that had gone completely cold. She did not know what was on the next slide, but the stillness of the man standing at the podium told her that whatever it was, her attorneys would not be able to write her way out of it. Jordan did not give her time to recover. He clicked to the next slide, the banking records for the reserve fund, the highlighted transfers to Sterling Solutions, the corporate filings showing her brother's name as the sole principal of the consulting firm, and the invoices for the pathway paving signed by her brother-in-law's construction company. Line by line, transfer by transfer, he walked the room through the 50-page audit report he had compiled, his voice steady and clinical, presenting the findings with the detached precision of an expert witness explaining a complex fraud scheme to a jury. He read the emails she had sent her brother discussing the payment schedule, the text projected on the wall in letters 3 feet tall, landing on the silent room with the heavy physical weight of a door closing. By the time he finished, the two board members, sitting to Evelyn's left, were looking down at the table in front of them, their pens clicking nervously, unable to meet the eyes of the neighbors, who were now standing in the aisles demanding answers. Several residents people who had spent years paying fines they couldn't afford out of fear of having their homes taken were openly shouting questions at the table, their voices rising all at once in a general unchecked anger that she had spent 6 years trying to keep down. The board's attorney stood up, his folder of notes clutched to his chest, and quietly advised Evelyn that the meeting should be adjourned immediately. It was too late. The room had already stopped listening to her, and the silence that settled over the clubhouse was the genuine article. The sheriff's department opened a formal inquiry the following morning, initiated by a filing Jordan's attorney had submitted to the county prosecutor's office, along with the certified survey, the audit report, and the recorded emails. Evelyn Sterling resigned from the presidency 3 weeks later, her brief letter to the board citing personal health considerations and conspicuously omitting any mention of the investigation, the Sterling Solutions accounts, or the concrete foundation that the association's contractors were currently excavating from Jordan's property at their own expense. The remaining board members voted unanimously to dissolve the enforcement committee, suspend all outstanding compliance fines, pending independent review, and issue a formal written apology to Jordan Vance for the administrative discrepancies that had occurred during her tenure. The new board, elected at an emergency community meeting in January and headed by a retired civil engineer who had lived on the ridge for 9 years, began its first session by adopting a new set of bylaws that mandated quarterly financial audits, public disclosure of all vendor contracts, and a formal recorded appeals process for any future compliance dispute. The old red farmhouse sat quiet in the early winter light, the smoke from the wood stove rising straight into a sky that had turned the color of slate. Jordan Vance walked the eastern boundary fence line on a Saturday morning, the fresh dirt where the concrete foundation had been removed, now graded and covered in straw to protect the soil from the winter freeze. The stakes with the bright orange caps were still there, left in place by Tom Willis as a courtesy to the landowner, marking the precise line where his land ended and the rest of the world began. He ran his hand along the weathered wood of the old gatepost, the cedar solid and cold under his fingers, and felt the specific steady peace of a man who had simply wanted his front door to belong to him and had been patient enough to make sure it did. A property he had come to understand through the long months of the audit was not simply a piece of land described on a deed or a name recorded in a county register. It was a promise kept alive across generations, a boundary that truth quietly protected long after everyone else had stopped bothering to look for it. I walked back toward the house, the air smelling of pine and wood smoke, and put the kettle on for coffee. He looked out over the pasture toward the houses of whispering pines, their copper roofs glowing in the thin January sun, and he felt neither triumph nor lingering anger. The account was settled, the boundary was restored, and the valley was silent again, and this time the silence was his own. He remembered how his father had reset those fence posts decades earlier, using a hand-operated post-hole digger and a bag of dry concrete mixed in a wheelbarrow. The work had been physical, demanding a kind of quiet exactness that didn't allow for shortcuts. His father used to say that a boundary only meant something if you were willing to walk it yourself, to clear the brush that grew over it, and to replace the rotted wood before the winter storms could tear it down. He had lived by that rule, and standing on the porch, now watching the shadow of the ridge stretch long and blue across the meadows, Jordan understood that the paperwork he had spent his life studying was simply another form of that same maintenance. A boundary is not protected by noise. It is protected by the unhurried, documented certainty of the people who belong to it. The yellow slip of paper that had started it all sat folded in the drawer of his father's desk, its cheap print fading slightly, its $87 demand reduced to nothing more than a curious footnote in the county's public files. The charging station was gone, the custom streetlights were gone, and the people who had believed their authority extended past the edge of the ridge had been forced to learn exactly where the line had always been drawn. The silence was deep, cold, and entirely undivided. There was a particular kind of peace that came from that realization, a quietness that settled into his chest, the way the evening fog settled into the hollows of the creek below his pasture. He remembered walking the property lines with his father when he was still young enough to think that the ridge was the edge of the entire world, and his father had stopped near the western corner to point out an old stone marker that had been carved with the initials of the original homesteader. "The land doesn't belong to the loudest voice, Jordan," his father had told him, his voice low and unhurried as he cleared a handful of pine needles from the surface of the stone. "It belongs to the person who has the patience to keep the records, to pay the taxes, and to walk the lines when the weather is bad. The people who come here later, the ones who want to build their houses in rows, they'll try to tell you that boundaries are just suggestions, that they can be moved if enough people agree to move them. But a deed is a promise, and a promise doesn't change just because the neighbors have decided they want a better view." He had not understood the full weight of those words when he was a boy, but standing on the porch now watching the first snow of the season begin to fall in thin, lazy flakes across the ridge, he understood them completely. The Homeowners Association had believed they could rewrite the history of the ridge through sheer repetition, that sending enough notices and levying enough fines would eventually make their authority real. But they had built their entire community on top of a lie, and the lie had collapsed the moment someone took the time to check the paperwork. The regional newspaper ran a follow-up feature on the Whispering Pines HOA 3 weeks after the town hall meeting, written by a veteran reporter who had spent 20 years covering property disputes and municipal governance across the state. She had spent 2 days in the county records room reviewing the files Jordan had provided, interviewing Ray and Lillian, and consulting with a land use professor at the state university who described the association's boundary claims as a textbook case of administrative overreach. The article was detailed, unadorned, and devastating, laying out the timeline of the fines, the altered boundary maps, and the financial transfers to Sterling Solutions in a clean chronological table that left no room for editorialization or excuse. Several of the board members who had voted to authorize the foreclosure proceedings against Jordan were interviewed, and each one offered a variation of the same apologetic explanation. They had trusted the president had signed the documents without reading them closely, and had assumed that an organization with legal counsel and official letterhead must surely have the authority it claimed. It was the same excuse Jordan had heard from corporate board members in dozens of fraud investigations, the slow, comfortable surrender of responsibility that always precedes a collapse. They had not been cruel, not in any active or deliberate way, but they had allowed themselves to be used as a shield by someone who was, and the consequences of that passivity were now written in public print for everyone in the county to read. Lillian Marsh came by the farmhouse on a Saturday afternoon in February, carrying a plate of warm cornbread and a small weathered wooden box that had belonged to her late husband. She sat on the porch with Jordan for an hour watching the birds work the feeders he had hung along the eaves and talked about the garden she was planning to replant in the spring. Under the new board's guidelines, residents were once again permitted to cultivate their own yards, and she had spent the week clearing the weeds from the old raised beds behind her house, preparing the soil for the tomatoes and herbs she had not been allowed to grow for 3 years. "I was ready to sell," she admitted, her voice quiet as she looked out over the pasture. "When the notices kept coming and the fines started doubling every month, I used to sit in my kitchen at night and feel so small, like I was living in a place that didn't want me here unless I could afford to pay them to leave me alone. I didn't have the money for a lawyer, Jordan, and I didn't know how to read the bylaws to find the lies she was telling us. If you hadn't stood up at that meeting, if you hadn't shown us those papers, I'd have been gone by the end of the winter." Jordan had nodded, thanked her for the cornbread, and told her simply that he was glad she was staying. I had not fought the association to become a hero to his neighbors, but as he watched her walk back down the gravel road toward her house, her posture lighter than it had been in years, he understood that the boundary he had defended was not just his own pasture. It was the quiet, ordinary lives of the people who lived beside it. The new fence was completed in the spring, built along the corrected boundary line with the help of Ray Holloway and two other neighbors who had volunteered to spend a Saturday driving the posts. It was a sturdy split-rail fence made from weathered cedar that looked as though it had been there for decades, its lines perfectly straight, its gates set with heavy iron hardware that opened and closed without a sound. He had reset the original mailbox post himself, leveling it with a plumb bob and packing the base with gravel to ensure it would stand through the spring rains, and he had kept his farmhouse deep and quiet in the same way it had been since 1954. The concrete pathway was gone, the custom streetlights were gone, and the ridge was quiet again in the way it had been when his father first built the house. He sat on the porch in the late afternoon, his coffee cup warm in his hands, watching a pair of red-tailed hawks ride the thermals above the pasture and let the silence of the valley settle around him. The Homeowners Association had believed that control was the same thing as ownership, that they dictate what a man did with his own land simply because they had the power to make his life expensive if he refused to comply. But they had forgotten that there is a different kind of authority, one that does not require clipboards or newsletters or Navy uniforms to make itself understood. The quiet, unshakable weight of the truth, recorded in county ink, signed by honest men, and patiently defended by those who know exactly where the line is drawn. It was his farm. It had always been his farm. And as the last of the light faded behind the western peaks, the ridge was quiet, and the quiet was entirely his own. The winter settled fully over the ridge, the frost silvering the split-rail fence and the bare branches of the oak trees along the eastern boundary. Jordan Vance spent his afternoons in the workshop. The smell of seasoned wood and wood oil thick in the warm air as he worked on restoring an old oak table he had salvaged from his grandfather's cabin. He worked slowly with the quiet, methodical patience of a man who had spent his life looking at the fine details, checking the grain, leveling the legs, and ensuring that every joint was true before he glued it. The work was physical, simple, and honest, a clean contrast to the years of tracing lies through corporate ledgers and financial disclosures, and he found in the repetition of it a kind of peace that he had nearly forgotten how to hold. The new board had sent out its first quarterly newsletter in January, a single sheet of plain paper that listed the dates of the upcoming community meetings, a proposed schedule for road maintenance, and a reminder that the approved paint color list was available for review at the library. There were no compliance warnings, no itemized lists of aesthetic violations, and no threatening letters from attorneys paid by the hour. The neighborhood was slowly learning what it felt like to live without fear, and the change was visible in the small, ordinary details of daily life. A child's bicycle left in a driveway, a garden gnome sitting on a porch, a different shade of blue painted on a front door. Jordan had not asked for any of it, had not sought to reform the community or teach anyone a lesson about the limits of their authority. But he had stood his ground on what was right, and the land itself had taken care of the rest. He reeled in his lines, closed his notebook, and went back inside his kitchen, warm with the smell of coffee and wood smoke. And as the night came on and the first stars appeared over the mountains, the valley was silent, and the silence was his own.